Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, the American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on mobilization, blockade logistics, and emancipation as a war measure. The core question is this: how did mobilization, blockade, railroads, black enlistment, and emancipation policy change what Civil War victory required? The core competency is to review military developments made during the Civil War. How does a war for union become a war that must also destroy slavery in order to win? The Civil War opened with a federal fort under pressure in Charleston Harbor. After South Carolina seceded and Confederate organization took shape, the status of Fort Sumter became a test of sovereignty. Abraham Lincoln chose to resupply the fort in April 1861. Confederate guns opened fire before those supplies could restore the position. The bombardment forced a national decision. Volunteers flooded recruitment offices in both North and South because compromise had now given way to armed conflict. Many Americans initially expected a short war. The first campaigns quickly exposed that expectation as false. Armies had to be raised, trained, clothed, armed, and transported on a scale the United States had never attempted before. Camps had to be built. Officers had to turn civilians into regiments. Quartermasters had to procure tents, wagons, horses, fodder, blankets, and rations. Military development therefore began as an administrative challenge before it became a map of famous battles. The border states made early mobilization even more complex. Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware remained in the Union, but their loyalty could not be taken for granted. Lincoln understood that losing Kentucky alone would alter river control, manpower, and strategic geography. That is one reason he moved cautiously on slavery in the first stages of the war. The Union needed to hold a broad political coalition while building armies. The first Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 showed the scale of the task. The battle ended in a Confederate victory and shattered hopes for a quick Union triumph. It also taught Northern leaders that short-term enlistments and thin preparation would not be enough. Longer commitments, expanded procurement, and more systematic command structures would be necessary. The Union possessed clear structural advantages at the outset: larger population, greater industrial capacity, more railroad mileage, and a stronger navy. Those advantages counted only if they could be organized. Railroads had to move troops and supplies over long distances. Telegraph lines had to carry messages quickly between Washington and field commanders. Depots had to hold enough provisions to keep armies in motion. A government that failed in any one of those tasks could squander its advantage. General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan captured one broad idea early in the war: squeeze the Confederacy through naval blockade and control of the Mississippi River. The image became famous, but implementation was demanding. A blockade required ships, sailors, coal, charts, maintenance yards, and patrol discipline along thousands of miles of coastline. Ports such as New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, Savannah, and Wilmington changed events because they linked the Confederacy to imported arms, medicines, cloth, and export revenue. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 added another layer to military development. George B. McClellan moved the Army of the Potomac by water toward the Virginia Peninsula in an attempt to capture Richmond. The campaign showed both the power and the limits of modern mobilization. The Union could transport large forces and siege equipment by ship and river, but command hesitation, Confederate resistance, and difficult terrain prevented decisive success. This campaign reads as a lesson in scale. The Union could move huge armies, yet movement alone did not guarantee victory. Ironclads, river fleets, and combined operations also changed the war. The battle between the Monitor and the Virginia in 1862 signaled the decline of older wooden naval warfare. Western River operations under Ulysses S. Grant and Union naval commanders demonstrated that rivers were military highways. Forts Henry and Donelson fell in early 1862, opening important waterways and weakening Confederate control in Tennessee. These developments changed the war because industrial war was inseparable from transport, engineering, and supply. As Union armies advanced, enslaved people began fleeing to federal lines in large numbers. Their movement created an immediate policy problem. Were they fugitive property under old law, laborers who could be returned, or people whose presence changed the military meaning of the conflict? General Benjamin Butler's 1861 decision at Fortress Monroe treated escaped enslaved people as contraband of war. That label sounded technical, but it opened a major shift. If enslaved labor was helping the Confederacy, Union forces could refuse to return it. Contraband camps followed. These camps required food, shelter, medical attention, work assignments, and military supervision. The camps were often overcrowded and under-resourced, but they made one fact unavoidable. Slavery was now inside Union military administration. Enslaved people were forcing the issue by acting for themselves, and commanders had to adapt. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 provided the opening Lincoln needed for a larger policy change. Antietam was not a clean Union triumph, but it stopped Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and gave Lincoln enough strategic footing to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He announced that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be declared free on January 1, 1863, unless those areas returned to the Union. This timing changed the legal and military sequence. Lincoln did not issue emancipation after a crushing federal defeat. He used a moment of relative advantage to change the terms of the war. The final Emancipation Proclamation, effective January 1, 1863, declared freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held regions and authorized black men to be received into Union service. That decision altered military development directly. Emancipation attacked Confederate labor capacity and widened the Union manpower base. Black enlistment soon became a central military fact. Nearly 180,000 black men served in the United States colored troops and other Union formations, while many more served the war effort in labor, scouting, and support roles. Their presence changed the composition of Union armies and the meaning of the cause they fought for. The 54th Massachusetts became famous after the assault on Fort Wagner, but it was only one part of a much larger pattern of service. Black soldiers guarded posts, fought in major engagements, endured unequal pay for much of the war, and proved that emancipation and military necessity had become inseparable. Recruiting offices, muster rolls, pay disputes, and regimental assignments made emancipation visible in the paperwork of the Army. The Emancipation Proclamation is the decisive source here because it shows military policy turning directly against slavery. Lincoln described emancipation as a fit and necessary war measure. Those words are doing military work. He was acting as commander-in-chief during rebellion. The proclamation did not free every enslaved person everywhere at once. It left slavery untouched in loyal border states and in areas of the Confederacy already under firm Union control. Yet that limitation does not weaken the document's importance. It clarifies how emancipation entered federal policy through war powers. The proclamation did several things at once. It struck at the labor base of the Confederacy by encouraging further flight from plantations and work sites. It signaled to foreign governments that the Union War now carried a clear anti-slavery character, making open support for the Confederacy harder to justify in Britain and France. It also authorized black enlistment more fully by stating that people of suitable condition would be received into the armed service of the United States. Place the proclamation alongside battlefield chronology. Fort Sumter began the war over federal authority. Contraband policy introduced slavery into Union administration. Antietam created the opening for preliminary emancipation. Black enlistment then transformed manpower and policy. The source sits in the middle of that sequence rather than floating above it. Read this way: the proclamation becomes a military document with vast social consequences. It did not end slavery instantly, but it redirected Union strategy. From 1863 forward, the Union could not plausibly fight a purely restorative war that ignored the slave system. Slavery had become a military target, a labor question, and a recruitment question all at once. The middle years of the war showed how military development and political transformation were now fused. In July 1863, the Union won at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and captured Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Gettysburg halted Lee's second invasion of the North and inflicted heavy losses on the Army of Northern Virginia. Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy geographically. These were battlefield turning points, but they were also logistical turning points. River control, interior movement, and Confederate coordination all suffered. Grant's Western successes and later unified command reflected a growing Union capacity to coordinate multiple theaters. The Union was no longer looking only for a single dramatic victory near Richmond. It was using river campaigns, rail disruptions, sustained offensives, and naval pressure together. Sherman later carried that logic into Georgia and the Carolinas. His army cut rail lines, destroyed depots, seized livestock, and targeted the infrastructure that sustained Confederate armies. This was war against capacity as well as against troops. Emancipation must be placed inside that larger picture. Every enslaved person who reached Union lines reduced Confederate labor resources. Every black regiment added manpower to federal armies or garrisons. Every campaign that moved through slave territory widened the possibility of self-emancipation. Military success and freedom were now interacting repeatedly on the ground. The war therefore changed meaning between 1861 and 1865. In 1861, many Northerners fought first for Union. By 1863, the Union government had committed itself to a war that also struck slavery directly. By 1864 and 1865, battlefield pressure, black service, and administrative capacity made that shift irreversible. The sequence explains more than a mere recitation of battle names. The judgment problem remains useful at the end. What most transformed the Civil War from a war for reunion into a war against slavery? Mobilization, blockade pressure, rail and telegraph coordination, or emancipation policy itself? A strong answer will show sequence. Mobilization built the armies. Blockade and river operations pressured the Confederacy. Antietam created the political opening. The proclamation and black enlistment changed Union purpose. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Sherman showed how strategy and emancipation now move together. That is why military developments in the Civil War belong in the same conversation as constitutional change and emancipation. The war forced the federal government to build administrative power, use military authority against slavery, and decide that victory without freedom would no longer solve the problem that had brought the conflict into existence. Medical and administrative adaptation formed part of the same process. The Union improved ambulance organization, expanded hospital capacity, standardized more supply routines, and learned from catastrophic early confusion. These changes did not remove suffering, but they helped armies remain active over multiple campaign seasons. A republic that could evacuate wounded men faster, refill depots more reliably, and move reinforcements by rail more efficiently could sustain the longer war that emancipation made unavoidable. Other military developments reinforced that shift. The Union capture of New Orleans in 1862 removed the Confederacy's largest city and one of its most important commercial ports. River transport, customs revenue, and export logistics all suffered. The war at sea and along inland waters kept proving that geography and supply could decide outcomes as surely as battlefield courage. Federal conscription acts and state recruitment bounties also showed how manpower policy kept changing as casualties mounted. The war machine had to be fed continuously with men, ships, and materials. Sherman's later campaigns revealed the same logic in operational form. His troops tore up railroad track, heated rails into twisted shapes later called Sherman's neckties, seized food stores, and broke the transport web that sustained Confederate armies. These acts were not random destruction. They targeted the infrastructure of resistance. Connecting Fort Sumter, Butler's contraband ruling, Antietam, the proclamation, black enlistment, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Sherman reveals the full sequence by which military development pushed the war toward emancipation and national transformation. By 1865, the federal war machine had become large enough to combine battlefield pressure, transport control, manpower policy, and emancipation policy in the same campaigns. Union policy moved from fort defense to blockade, from contraband rulings to emancipation, and from battlefield survival to social revolution. The harder judgment is whether the war could have been won while leaving slavery intact once Confederate labor and Union manpower needs became inseparable. The military record kept pushing policy toward an answer many had resisted at the start.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.